Welcome to the Life Stuff 101 podcast, dedicated to sharing stories and insights to inspire you to always make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. We talk to people who share their personal journeys and experiences, as well as to people who share their professional expertise. And there'll also be other times when we share personal tips and stories, which will hopefully somehow spark that aha moment for you too. Because we all have those moments when we think, I wish I had known that earlier in life. That's what Life Stuff 101 is all about. Our discussion today is for general information purposes and not meant to be specific advice. For personalized support and specific answers to questions you may have, please consult the appropriate medical or mental health care professional. Now here's your host who's on this wild adventure ride of life just like you. And yes, a real life person who's actually slipped on a banana peel along the way. Mental wellness coach and psychotherapist, Mio Yokoi.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Life Stuff 101, where it's my goal to inspire you to make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. My name is Mio, and I've been thinking about this idea of a mission statement or elevator pitch for this podcast for a while, because apparently it's a thing. It's a thing maybe that I should be doing, and I get it. It's a good way to be able to talk about what you do in a quick and pithy kind of a way. But a big part of my problem is that I'm not particularly pithy or quick, but I can see the value of having a quick soundbitey kind of thing to say. So far I have. Okay, here goes. It's my goal with Life Stuff 101 to inspire you to make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. So that's version number 1. So I'll say it again. It's my goal with Life Stuff 101 to inspire you to make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. Let me know what you think. I also have this one. How about this one? I have another one. It's not as pithy, a bit longer, but here goes. Okay. You ready? All right. It's my mission to inspire 126 million people to consider their mental and emotional wellness one of their top priorities, because the fitter and healthier our minds and emotions are, the better we are overall. So that's my second one. What do you think? I mean, 126 million people is a lot of people, but there are also 7 billion people on this planet. So, I mean, it's not entirely out of the question. And I also believe in the ripple effect. So if we have a community come together, make the commitment to understanding the importance of taking care of ourselves mentally and emotionally, I mean, I have no doubt that it'll spread. I mean, it makes sense. It makes total sense. And before you know it, 126 million people, right? I mean, I might as well aim high, I say. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you think. And maybe you can come up with the elevator pitches for the ages for me, because clearly I'm not that good at this. So if you can help me out here, if you have maybe something that you could snazzy up for me, that would be fantastic. I'd love it. Please share them with me. But on to today's episode. You'll be learning a ton today. I mean, at least I did. I had a conversation with Registered Psychotherapist Ayan Mukherjee. He's an EMDR therapist. Ayan patiently answers my many, many, many questions about eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is EMDR. So I might have said that really quickly. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. As a practitioner, his focus is on the mind-body connection and integrative approach to treating anxiety, low self-esteem, and PTSD, and EMDR is one of the ways in which he does that. It was also exciting to talk to Ayans because he is a mental health illustrator as well, creating psychoeducational illustrations and flipbooks for therapists to help explain complex concepts such as trauma therapy. So, let's just jump into our discussion today with Ayan Mukherjee.
Hi, Ayan. Before we dive into the meat of our conversation today, I'm imagining with all of the varied interests that you have and experiences that you have a ton of fun facts. But I'd love if you can start off by sharing at least one fun fact with us today.
hmm So when I was thinking of fun facts, you asked me earlier, one of the things that I'm a cat daddy, relatively new cat daddy. We have a 1-year-old Siberian named Albus, and I never grew up with pets. And at one point, I used to be a bit scared of cats as well. But my wife kind of sort of pestered me to get a cat, and now I love him. And yeah, so
Did you say that your cat's name is Albus?
yeah, Albus as in Albus Dumbledore from the
Dumbledore?
Harry Potter. Yeah, yeah. So we wanted someone who's kind of wise and more chilled out, and we thought, yeah, if we name him Albus, he might be, he'll grow into that name. He is some of that, but he's also quite naughty, and he also gets into biting spells now and then. And then we realized, oh, maybe Albus was kind of more like that when he was young. He was not always this old bearded guy all the time.
Wise. Yeah. And I do, like, I think that, actually I haven't really gotten into the longer sort of lore of Harry Potter stuff, but I think in his young age, he was a little bit more feisty. So
Yeah, yeah. So that's what we are seeing, I think, at the moment with
that's
Albus.
really great. And I'm glad that you've come to love him.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's dive into your work. And I'm wondering if you can describe the work you do and the approaches that you take in your work.
Okay. So essentially, I'm a registered psychotherapist. I've been in practice for about like 3 years, a little more, around 3 years, yeah. And my practice and before that, so that's important in the sense that before I became a registered psychotherapist, I worked, in commercial banking as a manager of a data analytics team. So my approach to therapy in a way is a bit more sort of result oriented, a bit more goal oriented. And at the moment, I'm operating more in the trauma therapy field. So I'm working primarily with sort of like PTSD, anxiety, complex PTSD, dissociation, that kind of work. And my approach is in a way that often I call my therapy a little bit more like a mental health boot camp. So I'm like, you're coming in, you're spending that much money. So I'm going to be of course, I'm going to be compassionate, and we're going to pace things accordingly. But I like to focus on, like, every session, what are we achieving in this session, coming at it at a little bit more of a corporate way, a little bit maybe. So yeah, that's kind of like my style of practice at the moment.
If you could maybe get into a little bit more about that particular approach when you say the mental health boot camp, and that, and I'm hearing that your approach is maybe more results oriented. Can you give me a little bit more details about sort of that mental health boot camp and more corporate, quote unquote, corporate approach that you talked about?
Yeah, and corporate approach doesn't mean that I only work with corporate people. It's not so much like that. It's often what has happened is I get a lot of men in my practice. So my practice is not primarily men, but say 60% of my practice, 60 to 70% are men. And often they're coming from this perspective that I've never done therapy before, and I don't know how sitting around and talking about my issues is really going to help me, right? And I've realized it when I was trying to find my own therapist back before I was still working at the bank. The challenge was that often therapists would start doing stuff, getting into processes right away without really telling me what are we trying to do here? What is the idea? What is the conceptualization of the case? None of that. Often it's just like, just boom, let's just go into talking about random stuff. So I like to sort of structure it a bit more, where after doing an intake, for example, I do a psychoeducation piece with my flip books, with my artwork, and I tell them that based on what you've told me, this is what I'm seeing, and this is what we would be kind of doing. This is some of the idea behind why we're doing this. Let me know if this is a good fit for you or not. And so, in a way, I want to look at it in this way, that I want to get my clients buy in. So if you're thinking of it from a corporate point of view, if I have a project idea, I can't just be like, okay, give me 2 employees to work on this project. No, I need to get senior management buy-in, right? Only then they would allocate resources to my project. And so if a client is allocating resources to my work with him, I also need to get his or her buy-in. So when I'm talking about corporate, I'm trying to look at it in that way. And that has been quite helpful for my practice overall.
So what I'm hearing is that it's a combination of your own experiences when you were perhaps seeking mental health support for yourself, and also coming from a corporate background where there were certain structures and frameworks in place. And then with the combination of working with a good number of certain types of folks in your practice, you have come to structure or come up with a framework of sorts that helps to maybe encourage collaboration.
Yeah, collaboration, and because I don't want my client to become like this audience, right? Like where I'm doing some stuff and they just sort of sitting there and receiving it, or that we're just talking about stuff in a relatively a bit more aimless way where there is no direction. Because sometimes I find when there's complex trauma involved, we have to be very careful as to where we are stepping, because often there could be landmines, there could be things that can break certain dissociative barriers that have been placed there by the client's psyche to prevent them from going certain places. And if we just go into them without sufficient preparation, it can be quite destabilizing. So that is something that I learned in my career as I started getting into trauma work, that I can't just, sometimes making it very free flowing can be a bit of a challenge. So yeah, some of these structures have organically shown up in my practice over time.
How would you say that you found that the some of the areas in which you focus on are trauma and complex trauma in your practice?
As in, how did I start working in this specialization? Or
Well, I guess I don't know necessarily if you would. My sense is that you focus. There's a focus on treating anxiety, PTSD, complex PTSD, and dissociation. I'm curious to know where that focus came clear for you, or how that focus came to be.
Yeah, initially I didn't have that focus. So once I graduated from the Transformational Arts College, which is based in Toronto. They have a bit more. They have a bit more of a transpersonal psychotherapy, even sort of spiritual psychotherapy background. So I didn't initially have that focus. And what got me into it is this book named Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and I found that really fascinating. And a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to do EMDR basic training. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it's a form of memory reprocessing therapy. And so this friend of mine asked me, "Oh, I'm going for this training. I don't know if you would be interested." And one thing led to another. I did the training, and I found it really helpful. And then I found a supervisor who's still my supervisor, and she specializes in complex PTSD, dissociative disorders, and stuff like that. So I started getting a lot of that exposure relatively early in my practice, and she started sending me clients, and then I started changing my own I did a bunch of other trainings in that, and so one thing led to another, and I got into this sort of niche in a way.
Okay. No, that's great. I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit more detail around your initial training, which you mentioned was a transpersonal approach.
So Transformational Arts College, their program has a bit of a transpersonal aspect. So by transpersonal, I mean they look at the school. We were taught to look at the whole sort of mind, body, soul connection, and not just looking at it from from a typical pathological model, right? We are looking at it at a slightly larger perspective. We were still trained and taught in your standard sort of mental health and psychotherapy related techniques and approaches, but there was also that focus that, okay, the person that you're talking to is greater than what they're presenting. It's not just the anxiety, PTSD, whatever. That is something that they're experiencing at this time in their lives, and we're looking at the whole person. And there was a bit of a spiritual aspect to that, spiritual, non-denomination spiritual. And so at that time, I was going through my own sort of spiritual awakening of sorts. And so that was the program that I found most sort of aligned to at the moment, at that time. And that's what got me into that program.
So I'd imagine, and you could maybe let me know if I'm off on this, but I'd imagine that with the transpersonal approach being a focus being the mind body, that EMDR is something that would actually dovetail quite nicely with that approach.
Yeah. EMDR, it actually, EMDR with its sort of brain body connection dovetails really nicely. And also, EMDR is it's a very EMDR in a way has 8 phases, and it's a larger protocol than just sort of wagging your finger in front of someone's eyes. And so a lot of other things, other approaches can be fit into the larger EMDR model. So I didn't find it very difficult to basically align whatever my approach was initially with the EMDR model. Though if you go into the EMDR world, it's a bit more oriented towards sort of the pathological model, rather than there's not a big focus on like higher self and spiritual meditation and things like that. And so there has been a bit of a shift where I'm doing less of that spiritual stuff in my practice now, even though that forms my underlying beliefs about the client. But I'm not that overtly spiritual in that sense in my sessions, gone more to that more clinical EMDR type approach. But that spiritual way of looking at things still, informs my practice, but I'm not overtly spiritual in my practice.
Right. It's part of your foundational approach that maybe it doesn't necessarily show up clinically as explicitly, if that, yeah. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more specifically about EMDR and maybe in relation to that book that you had mentioned, Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So Body Keeps the Score is a book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He's a eminent sort of a trauma psychiatrist as well as a psychotherapist in the US. And he was sort of like a pioneer in what we call trauma-focused therapy. And so one of the things that he mentions a bunch of different modalities that he has found helpful over his career. One of the things that he mentions is EMDR, and that's how I got to know about EMDR. Before that, I didn't have any exposure to it. EMDR is basically a form of memory reprocessing psychotherapy. And think of it this way, that when a new experience is, when your sort of mind is assimilating a new experience, the new experience goes through a digestion process whereby that experience gets sort of broken down into its individual components. So like the auditory component, the visual component, and things like that. And the brain also makes meaning out of it, and all of that then afterwards gets sent to long-term storage, long-term memory in a way. What happens when something traumatic happens? When something traumatic is happening, and this does not have to be big, huge trauma. It can also be something like attachment trauma, abandonment, breakups, things like that. When that is happening, the brain is often going into a bit of a survival mode. And when survival mode kicks in, the brain considers this digestion of memory to be a bit more of a secondary thing. It's almost like I gotta handle this and then I'll go do the reprocessing thing, the memory processing thing. And this is still like a theory, right? We still don't know very clearly why this happens, but for some reason, and not for everyone, but for some people and some situations, this reprocessing, this processing of the memory doesn't happen properly. And so the original trauma memory gets stored in the system with all the initial emotions that were associated with it. So the emotions didn't get stripped down. All the initial emotions, everything is sort of included. And when the brain looks at a memory, or some information which has sort of negative emotion associated with it, as we know from an evolutionary bias point of view, we are more biased towards the negative than the positive, right? So out of 10 things, if I tell you 9 positive things and 1 negative, your mind is automatically going to focus on the negative. And so as there's negative emotion associated with that memory, the brain goes like, oh my God, this is really important. We need to pay attention to this. And so that memory doesn't get, sent back into long-term storage. Instead, it hangs out in sort of like short-term emotional memory, short-term muscle memory part of your memory system, which appears to be a different part of your memory system as compared to long-term storage. And hence, for example, a memory of, say, if you're a person who has been, say, for example, bullied in, I don't know, high school or something like that, which might be, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago, versus what you had for lunch a couple of days ago. You see, right, the quality of these two memories. What you had for lunch doesn't have much emotional value, unless, of course, you're being proposed at this lunch or something like that, where there's greater emotional value. But the bullying memory, even though it is much older, can feel very vivid, can feel almost as if it's happening to you right now. And this is sort of what happens often to people who have experienced PTSD, where that old memory just doesn't seem to go away. It feels very vivid. And so with EMDR, what we are trying to do is we're trying to basically get our brain to realize, oh, this is what's happening, and to redirect the brain's attention to that memory and create the conditions for when the brain can start reprocessing that memory. So the digestion process that got stopped, we basically kickstarting that digestion process. And the brain essentially is basically going to those memories, stripping away the emotional content related to those memories, and then making some meaning out of it and sending the memory back into long-term storage. And while this is happening, so how it looks like is initially, if the memory, if we take, say, that bullying memory, and if I ask you from a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is neutral and 10 is the most intense, how strong, how intense or activating or distressing does this memory feel for you? And you may say, oh, it feels like a 7. It's, when I think about it, it's very vivid, very strong, lots of emotion. And the negative belief that comes up for me is I'm not good enough, or I'm stupid, or I'm worthless, or something like that. And so after we do the EMDR processing piece, what we notice, I'll be asking you, how does it feel now from 0 to 10? And you may say that, oh, now it feels like a 0, or it feels like a 1, where now when I look back at it, yes, I can see that there was something negative, something bad that happened to me, but it feels like an old memory now. It feels like it's done. It's no longer happening to me. It feels like the past. And now when I think about it, I do not get pit in my stomach. I do not get a heavy heart. I do not get any, intense body sensations. And now that I'm seeing that, because of that experience, I've grown, and I can say that I can feel more like I'm good enough. Earlier I was thinking, that thought of I'm good enough seemed very alien to me. But now, after as I'm not connected to this memory anymore, it feels this positive belief about this person then starts to organically show up and strengthen itself. And in short, that's kind of the EMDR process.
Once again, EMDR stands for
eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And eye movement is, sort of moving your eyes left, right, is one of the things, one of the core pieces of EMDR. But it was initially a core piece, but now there are other ways of, it's called bilateral stimulation. So bilateral stimulation is anything that's providing like a left, right sort of a stimulation. In my practice, for example, I use tappers. Tappers are these, little vibrating devices that you hold in each hand, and it just provides a vibration alternately. So left, right, left, right.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for a moment. What kind of a device did you say?
They're called tappers. So,
Tappers.
So Neurotech is one of the companies that creates it. So Neurotech tappers. Yeah, so that's a lot of therapists use that instead of eye movements, because eye movements, some people don't like it. It can be very tiring to your eyes. Yeah, so I prefer tappers over eye movements. It creates bilateral stimulation. That is one of the things that helps the brain go into that sort of reprocessing mode almost. And that's quite essential to the EMDR model.
So if I were to come to you, I had bullying in my past that has this residual effect, and I'm still, it could have happened 15, 20 years ago, and it's still something that's affecting me to this day. And it could be maybe in social situations or new situations, or where there's just people, I find myself getting anxious or disassociating, having difficulties. If that was something that I was maybe finding or noticing for myself, that EMDR is something that I could potentially seek out for support for that.
Yeah. EMDR would be a pretty good modality for that.
And so if I were, and if that were the case, and so bullying was something that I experienced, and I'm finding still that it's something that I have difficulties with in terms of residual memories and so forth, I come to see you. So can you maybe talk me through, like, very kind of, I guess, high level, what would happen if I were to come and see you and say, okay, I'm thinking about the possibilities of engaging in EMDR for my traumatic stress?
Yeah. So first, I would do an intake session. So my intake has a big focus on upbringing. So upbringing, family upbringing, as well as school and things like that growing up. After that, often I do a bit of psychoeducation with my flip books just to make sure that the person has an informed consent and they know what they're getting into. And then we focus on initially on stabilization. So phase 2 of the EMDR protocol, of the 8 phase EMDR protocol, is preparation and stabilization. So in the preparation phase, lots of things can be done. One of the things that we want to do is want to see what level of inner stability that this person has, right? So when it comes to memories and things like that, is this person able to contain the memories, or is this person having the memories flood all the time, that they are getting nightmares, flashbacks, etc.? Is this person able to do a state change? So state change is, if they are in a very anxious state, say in the clinic, in my room, can they go from that to a calm state, and what needs to happen for that to happen, right? And so in EMDR, there's a process of installing what we call installing calm place. So we imagine for the client, imagining a place that feels really calm and relaxed, etc., and strengthening that imagery, providing that calm place, installing and strengthening that calm place. And this calm place is often used later on in session to close sessions. So if we are working on a memory and there's not enough time and we need to close it down, we'll basically help the client go into a calm state. So be like, imagine you're going back to that beach, feeling the sand between your toes and the sun on your back, etc. And that way, helping the client go from an more activated state to a more calm state. So that happens initially, and this is where, based on the trauma that you've had, more stuff can be done. So I also do something called internal family systems and ego states therapy and structural dissociation work. So based on, whether you're coming in for, say, a single event trauma versus complex trauma versus high dissociation, all of that gets addressed in this phase, in this stabilization phase. We need to work on making sure that you're stable enough, not just in session, but if when we start doing memory work, when we start opening memories, will you be having enough skills to take care of yourself outside of session? So in case memories start flooding, in case other memories start showing up outside of session, are you in a state where you're able to close things down and stabilize yourself? Because that EMDR is awesome, but one of the things that can be a significant side effect to EMDR is flooding and destabilization outside of session. And so as EMDR therapists, that is one of the pieces that we really need to kind of focus on and be careful about. And so a lot of initial approach is preparation, so that you're preparing the client that if something bad happens outside of session, that they are able to handle and take care of themselves.
And in the preparation phase, what kind of timing is it that you'd be looking at?
So preparation phase can depend again. So if you're coming in for a relatively, say for example, if you are coming in for the bullying thing, and I see that you're holding a job or you have your own career, you're doing well, you say have a family, kids, and in your life otherwise you are pretty high functioning, for example. And initially, when we start doing certain things, I see that, oh, you have a pretty strong integrative capacity, that you can integrate things relatively quickly, have higher capacity for it, and are relatively stable. So when I start getting that information, then I know that, okay, for you, most likely that preparation phase is going to be shorter. Okay, so maybe even 1 to 3 sessions maybe is enough. And then we start doing memory reprocessing right away. We may not. My approach is, and this approach changes for different EMDR therapists. My approach is to not to go to the worst memory right away. We start with a bit of a peripheral memory. We start with a memory which maybe is a bit more recent and not as challenging, as a way to introduce you to the reprocessing phase, and then going on to more intense memories later.
And at this point, when you're talking about the different kinds of memories, are you already engaging the tappers?
Tappers, we are already engaging them in the preparation phase itself. So when we are doing, say, for example, the calm place installation or even other ego state therapy and etc., this is now what we can do is we can give you tappers so tappers, there's all this tappers or even eye movements, there's all this thing about slower speed versus higher speed. So generally what we do, kind of the rule of thumb is when we are doing some kind of what we call resource installation. Resource installation is where we're doing calm place or imagining a nurturing figure or anything more of an internal resource that we are developing and strengthening. We use, say, the tappers at a slower switching speed. So the left-right switching that's happening, it's happening at a bit of a slower pace. Same with eye movements. If I'm doing eye movements, slower pace and shorter sets. So maybe 15 to 20 passes. And then in when we're doing memory work, it becomes faster switching and longer sets. So maybe 20 to 30 passes.
So I guess I'm trying to picture what that looks like. So if I were to be working, you work with tappers, you mentioned, and if I have a tapper, so I have one in my left hand and one in my right hand. And as you are talking me through things, what am I doing exactly?
Yeah. So again, I'm talking about now my practice. So different EMDR therapists do different things. In my practice, as I also have a background in hypnosis, what I like to do is I would like to basically, if you're doing calm place installation, for example, would be, to be sit in a relaxed position, holding the tappers in your hands and keeping your hands on your lap. So, you're not getting tired. And I'll take you through like a guided imagery piece where I'm like, okay, imagine with your eyes closed, long, slow, deep breaths, and you're now imagining yourself, you're like, okay, my calm place is a beach where I went a few years ago. So imagining yourself there, feeling the beach, etc. And while this is happening, the tappers are going. Tappers are going left, right, little vibrations in your hand, left, right, left, right.
And so when you mean going, the tappers themselves they give some kind of stimulation or feedback or something like that?
So the tappers vibrate.
They vibrate.
It's similar to when you have your phone on vibrate mode. The way the phone vibrates, it's like that. It's like a little vibrating thing that vibrates, and you feel that vibration in your hand. So that's all. You don't have to do anything else with the tappers. All you do is you hold it in your hand and you feel the vibration. So it almost creates this sort of like this, it's kind of like a weird state where on one side, it's almost like your brain is focusing on two things at the same time. That's what we call the dual attention framework, where one part of your brain is doing whatever, either going into past memories or imagery or whatever. And the other part of your brain is focused on feeling the vibrations or feeling the eye movements in the present. So it creates this dual framework. And that's what is sort of like the essence of EMDR. That's sort of the core of EMDR. And now there's more research. So now then we go into more advanced states where, in more advanced EMDR practices, we can do, say, for example, parts work or internal family systems work or something like that, ego states work with the tappers. We are now bringing in dual attention framework into those kind of things as well. And that becomes a bit more on the advanced side of things.
So I can imagine the differences, though, between, and like you mentioned, this is what you specifically do in your practice, but that there is a little bit of a difference, imagine a difference anyway, between actually doing the eye movement, which is a physical, it's an active thing that I would need to be engaged in versus having tappers and feeling the vibration. So it does actually remove one active piece in the process, I would imagine. And not necessarily saying one is better than the other or anything like that. But while you're engaged in that process, there would be the difference between, okay, I need to keep moving my eyes left and right based on like what it is that I guess I'd be following something if I were to be doing that.
Yeah, you'll be following the eye movements, you'll be following my finger.
Okay.
Moving in front of you. So yes, there are different. So there's still some research going on as to what helps, and so there's research saying that okay, eye movements, for example, can be more intense. So if you're doing memory work, for example, eye movements shift things more than say tappers. But eye movements can be very rapid onset. So if you're really anxious or if you're really activated by a memory, eye movements can increase the intensity more than compared, while tappers being a bit more of a gentler process. So this again, and this is again different for different people. Most EMDR therapists, what they do is they start with eye movements. The client doesn't like it, then they shift to tappers or something else. In my case, why I don't like eye movements so much, this is just now coming to a preference, personal preference, is because as I like to bring in a bit of, guided imagery, hypnosis, that kind of stuff, that becomes challenging to do with your eyes open while trying to focus on my finger. It just becomes a bit more easier to do that with the tappers. But I have done eye movements before. So when I just finished my EMDR training, that time I was only doing eye movements. So I did eye movements for like a bunch of months. And only after that, once I got my tappers, I bought my tappers and I started doing other stuff. And I started playing around with different speeds and intensities of the tappers. So I find that to be more helpful in my practice now. And other EMDR therapists will tell you that I like eye movement, I don't like tappers so much. So sometimes it becomes a personal preference as well.
But really, the focus is on the memory reprocessing. It's how you get there might be different based on the therapist and their approach, but it's the memory reprocessing that is the focus.
Yeah, so the focus is you're creating a dual attention framework. How you create the dual attention, as long as there's some level of bilateral. So there has to be, at least from if you're trying to follow EMDR, there has to be some kind of a left-right thing. So when even with your moving your eyes, there's a left-right moving of your eyes. Tappers is a left-right thing. If you're, for example, even tapping with your hands, so that's also a lot of therapists would do. They'll ask the client to tap the sides of their knees with their hands, left-right, or certain times therapists themselves would tap the client's knees left right left right. I don't do touch in my practice really, but there are therapists who do that, right? So there are many ways of giving dual attention, creating the dual attention framework. As long as that dual attention framework is created, we would say that we are doing EMDR reprocessing.
And by bilateral, is that what you mean by left right?
So left, right, as in, and this again, we don't know. I don't know how much research is there, but one of the core pieces of EMDR is involving left brain, right brain, sort of left brain, right brain switching, bringing in both hemispheres, almost like from a stimulation point of view. So whatever we are doing to create that dual attention, we want to make sure that that has a left-right component to it. So bilateral, two sides.
This is so fascinating. And I'm wondering, since you moved into doing more of the EMDR work, what have you noticed with your clients, or what's the I don't know how to ask this question exactly, but I'm curious to know the differences, I guess, that you have seen in people as a result of engaging in EMDR.
Yeah, I mean EMDR. So EMDR can look the two ways EMDR can show up for a client. One is, which is what you may, if you now search EMDR, which is what you may see often. It's almost like this miraculous 1 to 3 sessions, and I'm getting troubled by this memory, this terrible thing, and I'll go for EMDR, do it for like 4 or 5 sessions, and that memory is gone now. I'm not troubled by that memory anymore. It's almost like a miraculous healing. That happens, but often what happens is people who are coming to see us, they don't have like a single event trauma. They're often not like just 1 or 2 events that have happened in their life. That's when that kind of a miraculous EMDR recovery can happen, when you're dealing with, say, 1 or 2 very specific kind of memories, sort of locked in time, not associated with other stuff. But what happens typically for complex cases is that, firstly, preparation itself can take much longer, right? The clients that complex PTSD, for example, preparation itself is a longer piece. And when you start doing memory work, lots of other memories can start coming in. So what I've seen with clients is, over time, yes, I've seen that people get better faster than typical talk therapy, but it's not like a quick fix solution either. It's not like you come in for 2 sessions and you're done, even though that can happen sometimes. And when it happens to an EMDR therapist, they're like thrilled. They're like, oh my God, I had that 1 session healing happen, very rare, kind of rare, but happens once in a while. And but the thing is, often with the general public, based on what they've seen on, say, mainstream media or from friends or wherever, there's this perception that EMDR, oh, someone told me EMDR is awesome and it'll heal me in 3 sessions, right? And so often I'm dealing with that. Often I'm dealing with re-educating my clients, saying that no, this is the process, takes a bit longer. But I've seen like a lot of change in a relatively short period of time for someone and often I get clients who are coming from long durations of talk therapy. So they would say that, and this is nothing against regular talk therapy, but they would say that, I've done a bunch of talk therapy, I've done a bunch of CBT, and that helped me to some extent, but I've hit a wall there. Like, it's not helping me anymore. So maybe 50% of my clients are coming in like that, with that kind of a background. So, and then we do see change with EMDR, and they feel good about it over time, but it's not a quick fix.
And I know that you and I, our conversation today, we've been focusing quite a bit on EMDR, but would you say that the majority of the work that you do with clients in your private practice is EMDR?
Yeah, so majority is EMDR, and I bring in other modalities as adjuncts to the EMDR process. So EMDR is my basic overall framework, and I bring in other things, parts work, internal family systems, mindfulness, etc., based on what's needed into that framework.
So in terms of, for instance, what you were just saying about 50% of people who approach you are coming from more traditional talk therapy approaches, is that something that you find is part of your practice as well? Or like you just mentioned, that EMDR is primarily your focus and talk therapy could be a part of that?
Talk therapy, I mean, I differentiate talk therapy from this, as in, like, where talk therapy is more focused on the narratives and the stories, rather than how that story or narrative is stored in the brain body complex, right? So yeah, so I would say I've become less and less oriented to talk therapy, though of course in between sessions, in between a bunch of, say, if you have done 2 or 3 sessions of reprocessing, often we have a talk therapy session in between, where we just do, like, sort of integration, where we just talk about stuff in the form of, okay, so how has that been for you, the recent reprocessings that you've had, how are you integrating that into your day-to-day life, some solution focused therapy. So, they say that, oh, this is what's happening in my relationship, so I bring in a little bit of, say, nonviolent communication. We do a little bit of practicing of nonviolent communication or relating skills, etc. So then I start going into a bit more traditional therapy sort of framework. But those are more like, I consider them to be part of the integration phase when we have done a bunch of reprocessings. And we may do that for 1 or 2 sessions and then go back to reprocessing again. And then again, do 1 or 2 sessions of integration, go back to reprocessing. So that's how I kind of blend it.
And I know that you had mentioned that there are 8 phases, and I know that we don't necessarily have to go through all 8, but what does is there a conclusion place within those 8 phases, or is it more of a cyclical process?
So I'll just narrate the phases quickly. We don't have to go into the first is information taking, history taking. Second phase is preparation, stabilization. Third phase is assessment, where we sort of activate the memory system. Phase 4 is reprocessing. Phase 5 is positive installation, so installing positive beliefs about with regards to the situation. Phase 6 is we call body scan, so we're scanning your body to see if there's anything else, any other disturbance remaining. Phase 7 is closure, so we are closing the session. And the last phase, phase 8, is reevaluation. So once the client comes back in, we reevaluate that memory again to see if there's any, since the last session, how did that hold? And if there are other stuff coming up, if there are other feeder memories, as we call them, are starting to show up, we then start again from about phase 3, 4, and keep cleaning it up like that. So in a way, it can be cyclical in the sense that the last phase, even though there's a termination aspect to it, there's also a place where you can start again from a new memory.
Right. So what happens is that even within a single session, you can find yourself going through the 8 phases, or between 3 and 8.
Yeah. So we can do 3 and 7 pretty much is what. So regardless of when you're doing 3 is what you would do anyway to set up the memory. 4 is when you are doing the reprocessing. And if you're running out of time, for example, and the reprocessing is not complete, you don't do positive stuff. You don't install positive belief. You go straight to phase 7, closure.
Great.
And next session, you do phase 8 reval, and then go back to phase 4 and go from there.
I think this is really valuable information because I think many of us who are in the mental health field or interested in the different modalities that are available, we don't necessarily always know the specific steps or sort of the details. And something like EMDR could be almost mystical or something like that, because it just seems as though it's like you go in and you do eye movements and get better or something like that, as opposed to really understanding that there is a very detailed and specific process that's involved.
Yeah. And I like to, when I've had other therapists who are coming from more, say, traditional talk therapy, and they ask me about EMDR. And always tell them that what I love about EMDR is that it's not, you don't have to get rid of all your therapeutic styles and your modalities now just because you want to train in EMDR. All of the stuff that you already know goes very well into, say, the preparation phase as well as in integration phases that can come after you're done with the memories itself. And of course, if you're, relationally oriented, for example, you're a relational psychotherapist, that's great as well, because at the end of it, you can't do EMDR if the therapeutic relationship is not strong enough. And the therapeutic relationship is still very primary, still very important. So that's what I find very cool about EMDR is that you don't need to basically completely dump everything that you know and then completely move on to this, very different model. And from the outside, it may, if you read the book, for example, by Francine Shapiro, it may seem like a very rigid model. It may seem like, wow, this is like 8 steps I need to do all the time, so rigid. But no, you can actually blend in a lot of stuff that you already know, that you already do, as long as you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? Like, so EMDR when we are training with EMDR, there's a big there's a big focus on, there's now also a thing where after you have done a EMDR for a while, you can start going into more advanced position states where you are breaking the 8-phase protocol. So you're modifying the protocol. Those are called modified protocols, where you're modifying the protocol based on what's showing up. So for me, for example, at this time, I don't do 8 phases in that sense all the time, even though whenever I can, I try to stay to that. But with other complex cases, you're doing a lot of different things, right? But as long as you know why you're doing it, as long as there's a rationale, okay, that I'm not doing a phase 5, I'm not doing positive installation. Why am I not doing positive installation? Do I have a clear idea as to why I'm not doing it? Or if you're bringing in, say, some other modality, if you're bringing in narrative therapy, mindfulness, etc., into a process somewhere, what's your rationale? Do you have a clear rationale as to why you're doing this? I feel if that is there, if you're doing it in a mindful way, then yeah, EMDR can be very flexible.
So the thing that occurs to me is that your background, your previous corporate background, and how you were talking earlier about the results-oriented, the solution-based approach, or the way of thinking, at least anyway, I can hear that in the way that you approach your therapeutic work. And I'm curious to know what the transition actually has been like for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it started in about 2012. I had actually a bit of I call it now my spiritual awakening in a way. I started having like sort of these weird, you can call it supernatural or paranormal experiences, like having sort of these vivid, very weird dreams, seeing colors, lights, all of that. Like almost like, I don't know what was happening to me, kind of a feeling out of the blue, right? Out of the blue. And it started to bring in a bit of a sense of like, what am I doing here? Why am I doing data analytics? And before that, I was trained as an engineer, electronics and communication engineer. I I was in India at that time, May 2008, when I graduated. Recession hit. I had no job. Friend of mine said HSBC Bank is hiring an analyst. Do you want to apply? I'm like, sure. I have no job right now. I might just go into that. That's how I got into data analytics. So it wasn't like this was my passion, something that I loved, even though I liked the work later, but it was not like this is what I wanted to do. So all that stuff which I'd kind of repressed in the past, that started to show up in 2012, and I started going into a form of depression almost, where I had to kind of like psych myself in bed 30 minutes before getting up to go to work, to be like, oh, go to work. That's when I started my own therapy process, and very soon, about 2013, I decided to, I really liked the process, and I was working with someone from Transformational Arts College. And because of, I wanted someone who could understand some of the spiritual, paranormal, supernatural things that were happening to me, and not just pathologize me or just, say that that's just hallucination or whatever. And so I found that model to be really helpful at that time. And in 2013, I started the part-time program at Transformational Arts College. So in a way, what happened for me is it was a long period. So you think of it this way, from 2012 all the way to end of 2017. So like more than 5 years, I had to basically almost live like a dual life. I used to, yeah, like I had this whole persona of the corporate banker persona from, I used to call myself the white collar hippie. So I had my 9 to 5 personality, and after 5 p.m., I was like going to these drum circles and therapy and psychodrama and all kinds of stuff, right? Experiences. It was a very, it was a kind of a challenging balancing act, and I couldn't really connect so much with my colleagues at the bank anymore. With their way of looking at things, and the way they were super like, oh, I need to get that promotion, and so invested in the work. I was not invested in the
Your
work.
priorities
It was
change.
going through the motions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so trying to still be interested at work, and listening to my manager say, you need to do better, and you need to focus, you need to work harder. And I used to be a really good employee before that. I used to be very conscientious, hardworking, and all that. And for me to keep doing that for 5 years when I really didn't want to, that was quite a challenge.
I bet. And it's when you had also mentioned that your background is in engineering, I can also see how that would also speak to sort of the systems type approach, that how you would think about things as well.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And now when I think one of the questions that you had asked me, when you had sent me that email of what is something that I could tell my past self that I've learned now. One thing I would tell my past self is that earlier I used to think that, oh, why did I waste 4 years doing engineering? Why did I waste, 9 years in banking? I should have done psychotherapy right out of like high school or something. And what I've realized now, that these things have really helped me in my practice, even in my practice. So for example, I've built my own website. I know how to use WordPress. I know how to do this, that. I feel comfortable with technology. And I feel like if I didn't have that engineering background, I would be, my engineering background helps me to be like, okay, you need to do this. And you can just watch a bunch of YouTube videos, read a bunch of blogs, and you're able to figure stuff out, basically. So engineering helped me to have that mindset that if I don't know something, I can just go online and figure stuff out, right? And so without that, I would have had a hard time setting up some of these other more business aspects of my practice, and as well as my mindset, as you're talking about systems approach. So that is something that I would tell my younger self, that, no, all of this adds value to who you are as a person. So yeah.
Absolutely. And it also would provide context for you in relation to the clients that you work with, especially in a place like Toronto, where you talked about earlier that people come in and maybe not necessarily understand what the process is. All they know is that maybe they're coming in and something is off or something isn't quite working. But because of your experiences, your felt experiences, your known experiences, they're just more of perhaps a contextualized connection that you can have with them, even if they don't understand your full background, that you have that experience of going through engineering and being in banking for as long as you were, you can have an understanding of where they are. And I would imagine that is, even if it isn't something that's talked about explicitly, it's almost like a known understanding that perhaps could be a part of the work that you do with clients.
Yeah, totally. And right away, I tell my clients that, there are two types of therapists, and this is not about, shitting on anyone, but there are two types of therapists. One are those who did grad school in therapy, social work, then masters in that, and now they have their practice. And then there are people like myself who didn't, who had a completely different career, and this is their second career. And so I often do get bankers, for example, and the moment I tell them, that, you can throw all your banking jargon at me if you're talking about work, and that's totally fine. I understand that world. So it just helps a lot in building rapport. and for the other person to see that, yes, even though you are an expert, or they're going to you because you're an expert, say, but that you're also human. It kind of like humanizes and reduces some of that power differential, I feel.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that you're so multifaceted is so fascinating to me. And I know that one of the other areas that you have gone into is you've talked about the flip books and the psychoeducation piece, and that you're a mental health illustrator. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I used to draw a lot as a kid, and then then life happened, and I grew up, and so all of that stopped. And last summer, I was actually going through a very slow. I just I started my full time practice end of 2017. So last year was my sort of growth phase, and that summer, I remember June, July, I was having very few clients showing up in my practice, and so I was quite stressed out. I was like, oh, I need to pay these bills, and my wife was very supportive at that time, and but still I was very anxious about like where would my clients come from and things like that. And so I wanted to bring in some kind of a creative outlet, rekindle an old hobby kind of, to help me with my mindset, especially if I was sitting at home or sitting in my clinic in between sessions, not having anything to do pretty much. So I started drawing. Initially I started drawing on paper, and then I got myself sort of like a digital like a tablet, and I started putting stuff on Instagram. And so initially it was all about stuff that would show up in my practice or concepts of therapy that I'm often explaining to my clients. And I was like, oh, or sometimes a client would say, I explain something to a client, and the client would themselves give me an imagery. Would say that, oh, that looks like, when you tell me this, I think of this image, right? Then I ask them, with your permission, can I draw that image, please? And they would generally say, yeah, go ahead. And so I then started drawing stuff like that. And I got a lot of validation on Instagram where people would be like, oh, this really helped me understand this concept. Or a therapist is like, oh, can I use this artwork to teach my clients certain things and things like that. And so this started in about June. And by like early this year, so about March, a bunch of therapists, especially EMDR therapists, told me that, if you because at the moment in the trauma therapy world, there is maybe only one or two sort of visual aids for psychoeducation purposes. Otherwise, there's nothing really. And some of the trauma therapy concepts are actually quite complicated and kind of difficult to explain. So I also, sort of like the business part of me also saw like a niche that I'm like, oh, actually there is a big dearth of material, and by then I already had about 100 drawings. And I was like, okay, let's see what I can create. So that way I created two flip books. One is a bit more specific to EMDR, so 18 drawings each. The EMDR one has about I think 6 or 7 drawings that are more specific to the EMDR process. And there's another book which is Visual Aids for Trauma Therapy, just more general, that has only one drawing related to EMDR, and it's more general. So it looks at a lot of different things, like different concepts like big T, small t trauma, window of tolerance, 3 phases of trauma therapy, polyvagal theory, internal family systems, attachment styles, so avoidant, anxious, that stuff. So a lot of different concepts that we can explain to, that we often are explaining to clients anyway, encapsulated in these kind of like cartoon like drawings.
Yeah, that's amazing, because I know for myself that I'm a very visual learner. And even though that I primarily work in talk therapy, I could see how these visual aids and these resources could be really powerful. And I just want to be mindful of your time. And I'm wondering if you might be open to actually maybe reconnecting again so we can specifically talk about this area of your work.
Sure, yeah.
Because I think that like just being able to talk about how there are different resources and different approaches or different ways that we can access thoughts, feelings, values, and those kinds of things, I think it's a really important thing to talk about. And I would really love for us to have the opportunity to maybe do a deeper dive into that.
Sure, yeah, I would be happy to do that.
I really would appreciate it. And like I said, I know that I'm just being mindful of your time. And I'm wondering, just to wrap up for today, if you could maybe share a go-to book or resources that you can recommend for people.
So I would say 3 books. One is Body Keeps the Score, so by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. So if you have experienced trauma-related stuff is showing up, that's a really good book. It's not a really layman type book. It's not like super self-help. There's some concepts that are a bit more, some of the language is a bit more jargony, but it's been great. And I've had a lot of clients say good things about it. The second one that I want to recommend is a book named Attached. And that brings a lot of stuff around anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, what to do if you have one of these attachment styles. Found it very helpful for clients going through relationship issues. And the last one that has been very helpful for me and my wife in our marriage has been, I think, 7 Principles to Make Marriage Work by Dr. John Gottman. Really recommended from looking at communication, relating skills. Yeah, it's been amazing. So 3 books.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I would imagine that your own work too at therapyillustrated.com would have great resources as well. Just to wrap up, whether it's something you may have learned through your work or otherwise, what is something that you wish that you had learned earlier in life or at school or something like that? Good to have known previously, kind of a life lesson.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, I beat myself up quite a bit growing up for not knowing what I wanted to do. So even engineering kind of happened randomly as well. I didn't really go into it thinking, oh, this is what I want to do. So there has been a lot of self-chastising for me on that, not knowing what I want to do. And now finally doing what I really want to do, I would like to go back, and if I could learn that, to just, just chill out, do what's ahead of you, do what you're supposed to do in the moment, and keep growing and changing, and not beating yourself up if you're not completely, engrossed in what you're doing.
Right. To not necessarily know what the future holds isn't a bad thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's really great. Again, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing things about you and your work and insights with us today. What would be the best place or ways for people to find out more about you and the work that you do?
Thanks a lot, Mio. This was great as well for me, and I'm really happy that you're doing this as well for people who are looking into demystifying different aspects of therapy. People can find me through my website. So it's ayanrp.com. So AYANRP. So RP, Registered Psychotherapist.com. Even ayanmukherjee.com will link up to my website. Even EMDR therapytoronto.com will link up to my website. Yeah, that would be the best way for them to reach out. I think maybe in your show notes or something, there might be my Instagram link as well. I'm not as active on Instagram at the moment, but a lot of my artwork, a lot of that stuff is there on Instagram as well.
That's fantastic. And definitely the resources and where you can find Ayan will be in the show notes. It'll be included in the show notes. So again, thank you so much. And I actually would really love for us to have the opportunity to do a deeper dive into your illustration work as well, and hope that we'll get the opportunity to do that soon.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for having me, Mio. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have to say, it was very educational for me to learn about Ayan's approach to EMDR, and it's definitely an area I'm hoping to learn more about in the future. And as you know, Ayan and I didn't get to dive too deeply into his work as a mental health illustrator, and I'm very looking forward to the opportunity of connecting with Ayan again so that he can share more about that part of his work. In the meantime, please go and learn more about Ayan at ayanrp.com, where you can learn more about him and his practice, and his illustration work can be found at therapyillustrated.com. That's therapyillustrated.com. And you can also connect with Ayan on Instagram, instagram.com/Ayan_Mukherjee_. But all of these links you'll be able to find in our show notes, so you don't have to figure out how to type all that stuff in. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you're listening to this point, thank you so much, because I have the opportunity to tell you that I've launched a brand new website for this podcast. Please go to lifestuff101.com. You can listen to previous episodes, get all the show notes, suggest topics, or perhaps you'd like to be considered to be a guest on the show. Find it all at lifestuff101.com. And on that note, lovely people, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day or evening, wherever you are in the world, and I will be speaking to you again real soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Life Stuff 101. If you haven't already, please subscribe so that you'll be among the first to be notified when new episodes are released. Always be sure to check out lifestuff101.com for show notes and to be a member of Mio's Miracle Mob. Because as the wise modern-day philosopher John Bon Jovi once said, miracles happen every day. Change your perception of what a miracle is, and you'll see them all around you.